My name is Hannah and I am 29 years old. My parents recently sent me a text message stating they needed to keep their distance from me and demanded I stop contacting them completely. My own brother helped them pack my belongings and toss them out on the street. I simply replied that it was absolutely no problem, but I would cancel my direct deposits first just to let everyone know. Before I dive into how my toxic family lost everything in the blink of an eye, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with people who only used you for your money. I run a highly successful e-commerce supply chain consulting firm. It is a business I built from the ground up through years of grueling work, navigating complex logistics, and spending countless sleepless nights analyzing market data. Because I know the true value of hard work, I prefer to live modestly. I do not wear flashy designer brands. I do not attend exclusive galas just to be seen, and I drive a reliable, unassuming sedan. My family, however, operates on the exact opposite philosophy. To them, image is the only thing that matters, even if that image is completely fabricated and built on a foundation of crushing debt. The defining moment of our relationship, the moment that shattered whatever illusion of family loyalty I still held on to, happened on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I had taken time out of my busy work schedule and driven to my parents' sprawling Miami mansion to drop off a gift for my mother Susan's birthday. The house was a massive, ostentatious property featuring a pristine front lawn, towering palm trees, and a perfectly paved circular driveway. As I pulled my car up to the heavy wrought iron gates, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a text message from my father, David. I picked it up fully expecting a question about what time I would be arriving for the afternoon celebration. Instead, the message read, "Hannah, we have discussed this as a family. We need some distance from you. You do not fit our lifestyle anymore. Please stop contacting us completely." I sat in my car with the engine running, staring at the glowing screen. My heart pounded against my ribs. Before the initial shock could even fully register in my brain, I looked up through the windshield and saw a chaotic commotion on the front lawn. The heavy iron gates slowly swung open, not to welcome me inside, but to allow my brother Brandon and his wife Keisha to march aggressively down the driveway. Brandon is 31 years old and loudly calls himself a visionary entrepreneur, though he has never successfully launched a single business in his life. Keisha is a stunning African-American woman who is entirely obsessed with luxury high society status and spending money she does not actually possess. My jaw dropped as I realized exactly what they were doing. Brandon was hauling heavy cardboard boxes out of the guest house and violently hurling them onto the hot Miami sidewalk. I recognized those boxes immediately. They contained my personal files, old college notebooks, and delicate childhood keepsakes I had trusted them to store in the guest room. I parked the car roughly by the curb and stepped out. The humid Florida air hit my face like a physical blow. Keisha spotted me immediately. She was wearing a clinging silk designer dress and oversized sunglasses, looking like she was ready to be photographed for a magazine cover, rather than participating in a cruel family eviction. "Look who decided to show up," Keisha sneered, speaking loudly enough for the neighboring estates to hear. She gestured dismissively at my simple linen blouse and tailored slacks. "I told everyone you would come crawling around wearing those bargain bin rags. You are a social liability, Hannah. You are going to completely ruin Brandon's aesthetic on the most important day of his entire life. He is pitching his new startup to a billionaire investor this afternoon, and we cannot have you loitering around our property looking like a desperate charity case." Brandon dropped another box onto the pavement, causing the cardboard to split open. My old photographs and personal documents spilled across the concrete. He did not even flinch or offer an apology. He just wiped the sweat from his forehead and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You heard Keisha," he said sharply. "We are moving into a new bracket of society today. We cannot have your mediocre energy dragging us down. You need to leave before our guests arrive." At that exact moment, the massive custom front doors of the mansion swung wide open. David and Susan stepped out onto the grand portico. My mother was already dressed in her lavish birthday finery, dripping in expensive heavy jewelry that caught the afternoon sunlight. My father stood right beside her with his arms crossed, looking down at me from the elevated steps as if I were a dangerous stranger trespassing on his exclusive property. "I read your text," I said, raising my voice so it would carry clearly across the expansive lawn. "You are throwing my personal things on the street on your birthday." Susan sighed dramatically, adjusting her pearl necklace with an air of profound annoyance. "It is for the best, Hannah. We are expanding our social circles significantly. Brandon is about to secure a massive financial investment, and our family is finally taking its rightful place among the elite. Your lifestyle, your lack of ambition, it simply does not fit our new aesthetic. You need to leave us alone." They stood there on their pristine driveway, forming a united front of arrogance and entitlement, waiting for me to break down. They fully expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for their love and plead to keep my place in the family. They truly believed they held all the power and that I would crumble under their rejection. Instead of shedding a single tear, I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. There was a massive secret I had kept from my brother and sister-in-law, and apparently a secret my parents had conveniently forgotten in their eager rush to climb the social ladder. For the past 3 years, I had been quietly keeping this entire family afloat. When David and Susan cried to me about mounting medical bills and the terrifying threat of losing their home, I stepped in without hesitation. I set up an automated bank transfer, silently depositing $8,000 into their joint checking account on the first day of every single month. That money was strictly supposed to be for life-saving medication and basic survival. Clearly, it was being funneled directly to fund country club memberships, Keisha's extravagant designer wardrobe, and the massive mortgage on the very mansion they were currently kicking me out of. If I did not fit their elite aesthetic, neither did my hard-earned money. I calmly opened my banking app right there on the sweltering sidewalk. With 2 simple, deliberate taps, I completely canceled the recurring monthly transfer. I stood there in silence and watched the screen confirm that the funding was permanently revoked. "You think this is funny?" Keisha shouted, stepping aggressively closer to the iron gate. "You are a complete failure, Hannah. Go back to your sad little life and let the real winners handle business." I did not say a single word. I just slipped my phone back into my pocket, crossed my arms, and waited. 10 seconds later, the tense silence on the lawn was completely shattered. Susan's phone, clutched tightly in her manicured hand, erupted with a loud, obnoxious alert. She looked down at the screen, and the smug, superior expression instantly vanished from her face, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. "David," she gasped, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "The catering company for my party today. Their final charge just declined. The bank says the account has insufficient funds." Before David could even process her panicked words, Brandon's phone chimed loudly from his tailored pocket. He pulled it out quickly, his face turning an alarming shade of pale as he read the notification. No, this has to be a massive mistake," Brandon stammered, staring at his glowing screen in absolute horror. "The auto payment for my Porsche just bounced. They are threatening to repossess it today." The panic sweeping across the lawn was immediate and explosive. The grand illusion of their elite billionaire lifestyle was crashing down around them in real time, and I had not even begun to show them the true devastating consequences of their betrayal. Brandon was pacing furiously across the manicured grass, his phone on speaker, as he screamed at a bank customer service representative. The robotic voice on the other end calmly repeated that his account was frozen due to suspicious overdrafts. Beside him, Keisha was frantically tapping her screen, her designer acrylic nails clicking loudly as she shouted that her platinum credit card had just been declined for a luxury spa reservation. The pristine front lawn had turned into a circus of financial panic. I ignored their frantic yelling and stepped carefully over the cardboard boxes they had thrown onto the concrete. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out a heavy manila folder. Walking straight up to Brandon's prized unpaid Porsche, I dropped the thick stack of papers flat onto the sleek hood. The heavy thud made him jump, and he nearly dropped his phone. My father marched toward me, his face red with absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and ordered me to get off his property before he called 911 to have me arrested for trespassing. He told me I was out of my mind if I thought I could sabotage their bank accounts and just stand there gloating. I kept my voice perfectly level and told him he might want to read those documents before he called the police. David snatched the folder off the car hood. Susan hurried over, adjusting her expensive sunglasses to read over his shoulder. I watched their eyes dart across the pages, scanning the heavy legal jargon and official county seals. I explained that 2 years ago, when they came to me crying about medical bankruptcy, they were actually 3 days away from total foreclosure. The bank was ready to seize the mansion and throw them out. I did not just pay their monthly mortgage to be a good daughter. I used my corporate LLC to buy their defaulted debt outright. I was the legal owner of the property. They had been living there solely by my grace, paying zero rent. And they had just thrown their landlord's personal belongings onto the public sidewalk. The color drained completely from my father's face. Susan stumbled back, clutching her pearls, as if the ground beneath her had just given way. The mansion, their ultimate symbol of high society status and elite wealth, belonged entirely to the daughter they had just called a failure. I reached into the folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and handed it directly to David. It was a formal, legally binding 7-day eviction notice. I told them they had exactly 1 week to pack their designer clothes and vacate my property. That is when Brandon suddenly burst into arrogant, forced laughter. He shoved his phone into his pocket and stepped between me and our parents, puffing out his chest. He sneered and told me I was pathetic if I thought a piece of paper meant anything. He bragged that I was about to look like an absolute fool because my little real estate trick was nothing compared to the empire he was building. Brandon loudly announced that his tech logistics startup was officially getting acquired on Friday. He claimed a massive investment firm called Vanguard Elite was buying his company for $50 million. He leaned in close, practically spitting the words at me, and promised he would buy the mansion from me in pure cash, just to bulldoze it while I watched. For a fraction of a second, I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Vanguard Elite. I looked at Brandon's smug, triumphant face, and a chilling smile spread across my own. I did not say another word. I simply turned around, got into my car, and drove away from the estate. Brandon had absolutely no idea that he had just threatened the silent founder and sole chief executive officer of Vanguard Elite. The pristine glass walls of my penthouse office at Vanguard Elite offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene I had just left behind on my parents' front lawn. I sat down at my custom walnut desk and opened my encrypted executive terminal. My hands were surprisingly steady as I accessed the investment portal. I wanted to see exactly what kind of fantasy my brother was trying to sell my firm. The file was labeled with a ridiculous, grandiose name projecting a $50 million valuation for a revolutionary logistics startup. I clicked open the pitch deck, expecting to find the usual corporate buzzwords and empty promises Brandon was famous for. Instead, as I scrolled past the flashy marketing slides and dug into the actual technical specifications, my blood turned to absolute ice. I stared at the supply chain algorithms, the unique routing architecture, and the core source code displayed on my high-resolution monitor. It was not just a similar business idea. It was a 100% exact copy of a proprietary software program I had personally coded 4 years ago. I knew every single line of that code because I had spent hundreds of sleepless nights writing it. Then the realization hit me with the sheer force of a freight train. That specific software had been saved on a backup external hard drive. A hard drive I had packed away in a sealed plastic storage bin. The very same bin Brandon had just violently hurled onto the sidewalk outside the mansion. He had not just evicted me from my own property. He had physically broken into my stored belongings, stolen my intellectual property, and had the absolute audacity to try and sell my own life work back to my company for a massive fortune. The scale of his delusion and theft made my hands shake with a new, dangerous kind of anger. I reached for my desk phone to contact my internal legal team. Before my fingers could even touch the receiver, a loud commotion erupted in the outer reception area. I heard my executive assistant firmly asking someone to step back, followed by the sound of scuffling heels, and raised, furious voices. The heavy frosted glass doors of my private suite were suddenly shoved wide open. Keisha stormed into the room, her designer handbag swinging wildly as she pushed past the security guard who had been trying to hold her back. She had somehow bluffed her way up to the highly secure executive floor, and the look of desperate, unhinged triumph on her face told me she was not here to apologize. Keisha marched across the imported rug and slammed both hands flat onto my custom walnut desk. The impact echoed loudly through the glass walls of my office, drawing the immediate and shocked attention of two senior vice presidents who were waiting in the adjoining lounge. Keisha did not care about the audience. She reached into her oversized designer bag and aggressively pulled out a crumpled yellowed piece of paper, slapping it down right over my keyboard. She loudly announced that she had just uncovered a massive family secret. According to her, the document she just threw at me was a newly discovered will from our late grandfather. She leaned in close, her voice dripping with venom, and declared that every single cent of the seed money I used to start Vanguard Elite actually belonged to Brandon. She paced back and forth in front of my desk, making sure her voice carried through the open doorway to anyone listening. She accused me of being a calculated thief, claiming I had stolen my brother's rightful inheritance to build my corporate empire. I glanced down at the document. It looked utterly absurd, printed on standard bright white copy paper that had been deliberately wrinkled, featuring a highly questionable signature at the bottom. My grandfather had passed away completely broke, leaving behind nothing but a stack of unpaid medical bills and a rusty pickup truck. There was no secret fortune, but the threat she was making was very real. Keisha leaned over my desk again, lowering her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper. She laid out her terms with the absolute confidence of someone who thought they held all the cards. She demanded that I immediately sign over the deed to the Miami mansion and completely drop the eviction notice against my parents. If I refused to hand over the multi-million-dollar property, she promised to take this fraudulent will straight to the financial press. She threatened to drag my name through the mud and destroy Vanguard Elite's spotless reputation with a massive, very public embezzlement scandal right before my company was scheduled to release our quarterly earnings report. My security guards were already stepping into the suite, waiting for my signal to physically remove her from the premises. But instead of pointing out the obvious forgery or having her thrown out into the street, a different strategy formed in my mind. I decided to give Keisha exactly the reaction she was hoping for. I held up my hand to stop the guards. I let my shoulders slump forward in defeat. I widened my eyes, forcing my breathing to become rapid and shallow. I made my hands tremble visibly as I reached out to touch the piece of paper. I whispered her name, begging her to keep her voice down and pleading with her not to go to the media. The look of absolute supremacy on her face was almost comical. She fed on my supposed weakness, her chest puffing out with pride. She shoved a luxury pen into my shaking hand and demanded I sign a handwritten receipt. The receipt explicitly acknowledged the existence of the will and clearly outlined her specific demands regarding the transfer of the house in exchange for her silence. I let a fake desperate tear slip down my cheek as I shakily signed my name on the dotted line. Keisha snatched the paper back, gave me a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, and told me I had exactly 24 hours to transfer the deed before she ruined my entire life. She turned on her heel and strutted out of the executive suite like she had just conquered the financial world. I kept my head buried in my hands, maintaining the performance of a broken, terrified woman until the private elevator doors chimed and fully closed behind her. The second the digital floor indicator showed she was descending to the lobby, my trembling stopped. I sat up perfectly straight, wiped the fake tear from my cheek, and smoothed my blazer. I pressed a button on my intercom. My director of security and IT stepped into the office a moment later, looking deeply concerned about the chaotic scene that had just unfolded in front of the senior executives. I smiled warmly at him and asked him to pull the security footage from the hidden cameras integrated into the ceiling panels above my desk. I specifically requested the uncompressed high-definition video files, making sure to emphasize that I needed the crystal-clear audio enhancement. Keisha had just waltzed into a highly monitored financial institution and explicitly laid out a quid pro quo threat to extort real estate in exchange for suppressing forged documents. I had not just given her a terrified signature. I had just effortlessly captured a textbook, undeniable federal blackmail felony on tape. While Keisha was marching out of my office, believing she had just won the ultimate victory, my parents were busy staging their own desperate performance across town. At the prestigious Coral Gables Country Club, David and Susan were hosting a lavish afternoon brunch. They were dressed in their absolute finest, my father in a custom-tailored pastel linen suit, and my mother draped in heavy gold jewelry, paid for entirely by my stolen money. They were desperately trying to maintain the illusion that they were untouched by the morning's financial catastrophe. Sitting at a table surrounded by Miami's elite, they were spinning an elaborate web of lies about Brandon's upcoming mega deal, sipping imported champagne, and acting as if they owned the world. Just as David confidently raised his crystal flute to propose a boastful toast to the family's expanding empire, a loud, grinding metallic screech shattered the refined atmosphere of the dining room. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, every single wealthy club member got a front-row seat to the spectacle unfolding in the valet roundabout. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck had aggressively backed up to the curb. The driver was actively slamming a massive steel hook directly under the chassis of my parents' gleaming unpaid luxury SUV. The absolute panic that washed over my father's face was instantaneous. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered against the imported tile floor. He sprinted through the dining room, pushing past startled waiters and bursting out the heavy mahogany front doors. He practically threw himself at the greasy arm of the repo man, screaming that it was a massive banking error, begging the man to stop the winch. But the tow truck driver simply shrugged, handed my red-faced, shouting father a bright pink repossession slip, and hoisted the luxury vehicle into the air. Inside the dining room, the social execution was absolute and unforgiving. The wealthy socialites my mother had spent decades trying to impress were now openly pointing and whispering behind their manicured hands. Several younger club members already had their smartphones out, recording David's humiliating public meltdown on the curb. Susan shrank down into her upholstered chair, covering her face with a linen napkin, experiencing the one thing she feared more than death itself: public poverty. With their credit cards completely frozen and their ultimate status symbol hauled away down the street, my parents suffered a crushing indignity. They were forced to quietly call a budget rideshare service to take them to a cheap local rental agency. They had to scrape together whatever spare cash they had in their wallets just to rent a beat-up compact economy car. The reality of their situation was finally setting in. They were entirely cut off from the lifestyle they felt entitled to. Later that afternoon, I stepped out of the private elevator into the gleaming marble lobby of my luxury condo building. I was immediately ambushed. David and Susan practically lunged from the waiting area. The arrogant, superior monsters who had coldly instructed me to leave their property just hours ago had completely vanished. In their place were two desperate, sniveling actors. Susan immediately turned on the waterworks. Real tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup as she rushed forward. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, sobbing loudly about how blood is thicker than water. She begged me to remember family loyalty. She pleaded with me to unfreeze the bank accounts, crying that they were completely destitute, unable to afford their basic living expenses, and that I was effectively sentencing them to suffer without their necessary medical treatments. David stood right behind her, his shoulders slumped, looking like a broken man. He nodded along with her sobs, promising that if I just turned the direct deposits back on, they would forgive my earlier trespasses and welcome me back into the family fold with open arms. I did not pull away. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked over to the sleek glass coffee table in the center of the lobby and unzipped my tote bag. I pulled out a thick stack of printed, heavily highlighted financial documents and dropped them flat onto the table with a sharp, heavy thud. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and told her the medical bill excuse officially expired the second I ordered a forensic audit of their accounts. I pointed down at the bank statements and began reading the highlighted charges aloud, intentionally making sure my voice carried across the echoey marble lobby for the concierge and the front desk security guards to hear. I listed off the $50,000 funneled directly to offshore gambling sites to cover Brandon's degenerate betting debts. I read out the $30,000 spent at European designer boutiques to fund Keisha's luxury handbag collection. I pointed to the exorbitant bar tabs at elite clubs, the five-star resort vacations, and the massive monthly mortgage payments on a mansion they did not even own. I stated clearly with absolute icy precision that in 3 years of funding their supposed life-saving medical care, there was not a single charge from a hospital, a doctor, or a pharmacy. The fake manipulative tears on Susan's face instantly dried up, replaced by stark, paralyzing terror. David stared down at the highlighted bank statements as if the paper itself were actively on fire. Their ultimate manipulation tactic, the guilt trip they had used to bleed me dry for years, had been completely dismantled with hard, undeniable data. I leaned in close, the scent of her expensive stolen perfume making my stomach turn. I told them that the Bank of Hannah was permanently closed, and if they ever dared to ambush me in my own home again, I would have them arrested for harassment. I turned on my heel and strode back toward the private elevators, leaving my parents standing over the undeniable proof of their own greed, sobbing genuinely for the very first time in their lives, in the middle of a cold, empty lobby. The performance of a weeping, heartbroken father lasted exactly 14 hours. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the tears had completely evaporated, replaced by a venomous, calculating arrogance that proved my decision to cut them off was entirely correct. I was sitting at my desk in my Vanguard Elite penthouse suite, reviewing international market reports, when my private secure line flashed. My head of security informed me that my father was downstairs in the lobby, demanding to see me. He was not alone. He had brought a man who claimed to be legal counsel, and they were threatening to create a massive public scene if I did not grant them immediate access. I told security to escort them up. I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate hand they thought they were holding. The frosted glass doors to my executive suite swung open. David strode into the room with his chest puffed out, radiating the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he had just cornered his prey. The pathetic, sobbing creature from my condo lobby was entirely gone. Beside him stood a man in a poorly tailored pinstripe suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase. The lawyer reeked of cheap cologne and late-night television commercials. He introduced himself as Donovan Cross, lead counsel for Brandon's new technology enterprise. My father did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply walked straight up to my desk, pulled a massive, heavy-bound legal document from Donovan's briefcase, and slammed it down onto my glass desktop with a deafening crack. He leaned forward, placing his knuckles on my desk, and stared at me with pure malice. He told me that my little power trip was officially over. He announced that Brandon was suing me and my consulting firm for severe malicious intellectual property theft. I looked down at the massive stack of paper, then back up at my father, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I asked him to explain exactly what I had supposedly stolen from a man who had never successfully held a job in his adult life. Donovan stepped forward, opening the binder to a page filled with dense, fabricated legal jargon. The lawyer smugly declared that Brandon had spent the last 3 years tirelessly developing a revolutionary logistics and supply chain algorithm. According to their ridiculous narrative, I had used my position as a consultant to gain access to his private computer, illegally copy his proprietary source code, and use it to build my own business models. They were claiming that I built my entire career on the back of Brandon's genius. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the lie almost made me laugh out loud. They had taken the reality of the situation, the fact that Brandon had physically broken into my storage boxes and stolen my old hard drive containing the code I wrote years ago, and completely reversed it. They were accusing me of the exact federal crime Brandon was currently committing. David crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me with a sickeningly triumphant grin. He proudly announced that Brandon's startup was just days away from a $50 million acquisition by the most powerful investment firm in the city, Vanguard Elite. My father practically spat the name of my own company at me, wielding it like a loaded weapon. He boasted that when Brandon signed the final acquisition papers on Friday, Vanguard Elite's army of ruthless corporate lawyers would take over this intellectual property lawsuit. David promised me that Vanguard had the capital and the vicious legal power to crush my small consulting firm into absolute dust. He swore that by the time Vanguard was done with me, I would be bankrupt, professionally blacklisted, and facing criminal charges for corporate espionage. The irony was so rich and layered it was almost intoxicating. My father was standing in the private penthouse office of Vanguard Elite, threatening the founder of Vanguard Elite, with the legal team of Vanguard Elite. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to press the button on my desk, summon my actual general counsel, and end the charade right then and there. But I needed something from them. I needed to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, it would completely obliterate Brandon's ability to ever con another human being again. I looked at Donovan and asked what exactly they wanted to make this lawsuit go away. The sleazy lawyer smiled, revealing perfectly bleached teeth, and slid a single sheet of paper across my desk. It was a pre-drafted settlement agreement. The terms were staggering in their greed. Donovan explained that Brandon was willing to be generous and drop the intellectual property theft charges on two non-negotiable conditions. First, I had to immediately sign over the deed to the Miami mansion, transferring total legal ownership to Brandon and Keisha. Second, I had to pay a punitive damage settlement of $5 million directly into their joint bank account within 48 hours. If I agreed, the family would gracefully allow me to continue operating my consulting business without Vanguard Elite crushing me. I stared at the settlement document. My mind was moving 100 miles a minute, calculating the legal angles. I already had the security footage of Keisha committing extortion. I had the digital timestamps proving I wrote the logistics code 4 years before Brandon even knew what a supply chain was. But to secure a federal wire fraud and perjury conviction with absolute certainty, I needed Brandon to state on the record under oath that he was the sole creator of that code. If he signed a sworn affidavit claiming ownership of the stolen property to secure a financial settlement, the FBI would have him dead to rights. I needed to spring the trap, and to do that I had to play the victim one last time. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I picked up the settlement agreement. I let my breath hitch, widening my eyes as I looked up at my father. I asked him if he would truly allow a massive corporation to destroy his own daughter over a lie. I let my voice crack, pitching it perfectly to sound like a terrified, cornered animal. David did not show a single ounce of pity. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and stated that I brought this entirely on myself when I disrespected the family and canceled their credit cards. He told me I had 24 hours to sign the settlement, or he would personally make sure I ended up in a prison cell. I dropped the paper back onto the desk, burying my face in my hands for a brief moment to hide the calculating gleam in my eyes. I looked back up at Donovan, projecting pure desperation. I told the lawyer that $5 million was an enormous amount of liquidity to move, and that transferring a property deed required proper legal oversight. I pleaded with them, saying that if I was going to surrender my entire life savings and my property, I needed a formal, legally binding mediation to settle the dispute properly. I requested that we set up an official mediation session on Thursday afternoon, just one day before Brandon's big pitch to Vanguard Elite. I insisted that Brandon had to be present to sign the final releases, and that everything had to be documented by a certified legal mediator, so I would be protected from future lawsuits. Donovan's eyes lit up with predatory greed. He looked at David and gave a sharp, confident nod. They saw a terrified, wealthy woman offering exactly what they wanted, practically begging to hand over her assets through official channels. They thought they had broken me. They thought the threat of Vanguard Elite had terrified me into absolute submission. David slammed his hand flat on my desk, declaring that I finally understood my place. He agreed to the formal mediation on Thursday, warning me not to try any last-minute tricks or the deal was off and the lawsuit would proceed. They turned and marched out of my executive suite, victorious and arrogant, leaving the massive binder of fabricated evidence on my desk. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them. The second they were out of sight, my trembling hands instantly steadied. The terrified, defeated posture vanished, and I sat back in my high-backed leather executive chair. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I picked up my phone to call my personal legal team. David and Brandon had just enthusiastically agreed to sit in a recorded room and sign legally binding documents regarding stolen property. They were eagerly marching straight into the most devastating perjury trap in corporate history, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the keys to the prison cell. While my legal team quietly arranged the formal mediation for Thursday afternoon, my brother and sister-in-law decided to launch a preemptive strike. They did not just want my money and my property. They wanted to completely destroy my reputation before I could even sit down at the negotiating table. Keisha and Brandon weaponized social media with a level of vicious calculation that genuinely surprised me. Keisha spearheaded the digital assault. She recorded highly edited, tear-filled videos from the driver's seat of her rental car, broadcasting to her thousands of followers. She played the ultimate victim, dabbing at her dry eyes and crying about how a toxic, deeply jealous relative was trying to steal her husband's billion-dollar dream. She spun a wildly fabricated story about how Brandon had worked himself to the bone to build a revolutionary logistics company, only for his spiteful sister to use her corporate connections to try and sabotage his success right before a massive acquisition. Brandon immediately followed up by posting lengthy self-righteous threads on professional networking sites. He painted himself as a resilient visionary, battling family betrayal, claiming that true innovators always face persecution from those who lack ambition. The digital mob descended almost instantly. The narrative of a brilliant, hardworking couple being targeted by a greedy, vindictive family member was perfectly engineered to go viral. My personal cell phone began vibrating nonstop. My inbox flooded with hateful messages. Extended relatives who had not bothered to check on me in over a decade suddenly found the time to leave me blistering voicemails. My father's sister left a 4-minute voice message calling me a monster, screaming that I was an absolute disgrace to the family name for trying to extort my own flesh and blood. Internet strangers tracked down the public contact pages for my consulting firm, burying my business profiles under an avalanche of 1-star reviews and aggressive, threatening comments. They called me a corporate parasite. They demanded I leave the brilliant entrepreneur alone. The situation escalated so rapidly that the head of public relations for my consulting firm sprinted into my office, clutching his tablet in sheer panic. He showed me the trending hashtags and the thousands of negative comments pouring in by the second. He begged me to let him release a formal statement. He pleaded for permission to issue a massive, very public cease and desist order to shut down the defamation before it caused irreparable damage to our client relationships. I looked at the trending videos of Keisha fake crying for the camera and Brandon soaking up the digital praise. I calmly handed the tablet back to my public relations director and ordered absolute total silence. I strictly forbade anyone in my company from responding, commenting, or defending my name. When your enemies are busy digging their own graves, the absolute worst thing you can do is take away their shovels. I wanted them to feel untouchable. I needed them to walk into that mediation room believing they had the entire world on their side. Thursday afternoon arrived with a suffocating heavy tension. The formal mediation took place in a neutral, high-end law office downtown. The air conditioning was practically freezing, but the atmosphere inside the polished glass conference room was boiling. David, Susan, Keisha, and Brandon sat on one side of the massive granite table. They were practically vibrating with arrogant triumph, flanked by their sleazy lawyer Donovan. I sat on the opposite side with the court-appointed mediator looking exactly like the exhausted, beaten-down victim they expected me to be. Donovan kicked off the meeting by aggressively sliding the $5 million settlement demand and the property transfer deed across the table. He pompously declared that given the immense public pressure and the undeniable brilliance of his client's intellectual property, I had no choice but to sign the documents and surrender my assets immediately. I kept my head slightly bowed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I looked across the table at my brother. I let my voice tremble just enough to sound thoroughly intimidated. I looked at the thick stack of technical documents they claimed Brandon had written. I told Brandon I just did not understand how he had built something so incredibly complex so quickly. I stroked his massive, fragile ego with surgical precision. I murmured that the supply chain routing architecture was brilliant, almost too brilliant. I softly questioned how he had managed to balance the load distributions, feigning absolute awe at his supposed genius. Brandon took the bait instantly. He puffed out his chest, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with a sickeningly smug grin. He loudly boasted that true genius could not be rushed or faked. He bragged about spending thousands of grueling hours locked in his home office writing every single line of that code entirely from scratch. I pushed back just a fraction of an inch, letting a tiny sliver of doubt creep into my voice. I told the mediator that I was willing to settle, but I simply could not believe Brandon did not outsource at least some of the core development. I suggested that the code was too flawless for one man to write alone, hinting that he must have hired outside developers to assist him. The subtle insult to his intelligence worked perfectly. Brandon slammed his hand on the granite table, his face flushing with offended pride. He aggressively pointed his finger at me and shouted that he was the sole exclusive architect of the entire platform. He vehemently denied receiving a single drop of outside help, furious that I would dare question his capability in front of his lawyer and his adoring wife. Donovan, smelling blood in the water and eager to lock down his percentage of the $5 million settlement, immediately pulled a fresh document from his briefcase. It was a sworn formal affidavit of intellectual property ownership. The lawyer shoved a pen into Brandon's hand, telling him to put it in writing to silence my doubts once and for all. Without hesitating for a single second, driven entirely by his own towering arrogance and desperate need to prove his superiority, Brandon aggressively signed his name on the dotted line. The mediator stamped the document, officially notarizing his signature. Brandon had just sworn under oath, under penalty of federal perjury, that he was the sole and exclusive creator of a proprietary software code that I had legally copyrighted 4 years ago. He handed the notarized affidavit back across the table with a triumphant, mocking laugh, demanding I sign the settlement money over immediately. I stared down at the freshly stamped, legally binding confession resting on the granite table, and the trap finally perfectly snapped shut. Back in the secure confines of my Vanguard Elite headquarters, the final phase of my operation was already quietly executing itself. Whenever an acquisition of this magnitude is placed on the table, standard corporate protocol dictates a rigorous due diligence process. I had tasked my chief financial officer and a specialized team of forensic accountants to tear into the financial architecture of Brandon's startup. They were instructed to trace every single dollar, verify every vendor contract, and audit the entire corporate structure before Friday's big pitch meeting. I expected them to find sloppy bookkeeping, inflated user metrics, and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. I severely underestimated the depth of my brother's depravity. On Wednesday morning, my chief financial officer walked into my penthouse suite, closed the frosted glass doors, and handed me a thick red flag dossier. He looked at me with grave professional concern and stated that we were no longer looking at a poorly managed tech startup. We were looking at a sprawling, highly coordinated criminal syndicate. As I flipped through the densely packed financial audits, the full scope of Brandon's desperation became crystal clear. Years of gambling and failed ventures had completely ruined Brandon's personal credit score. No legitimate bank would ever lend him a dime. So, to fund his delusion of being a wealthy Silicon Valley visionary, he had committed massive systematic identity theft against his own wife. Without Keisha having any knowledge of the scheme, Brandon had weaponized her social security number. He used her pristine credit history to covertly establish a complex web of shell companies registered across Delaware and Nevada. He had forged her signature on dozens of federal financial documents, using these phantom corporations to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent business loans. But the fraud did not stop at securing capital. Brandon had been funneling the remaining borrowed cash through these shell entities to completely evade corporate taxes, leaving a massive, glaring trail of federal tax evasion. Because Keisha's name and social security number were on every single founding document and loan application, she was technically the sole owner of the financial ruin. If the business collapsed, Brandon would walk away clean, while his wife took the absolute brunt of the criminal liability. He was entirely willing to let Keisha go to federal prison just to maintain his facade of wealth. The sheer sociopathic nature of the crime eliminated any lingering shred of sympathy I might have harbored for my family. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I instructed my chief financial officer to compile the unredacted financial audit, the shell company tax records, and the loan applications featuring Keisha's forged signatures. I took that massive digital dossier, attached the sworn perjury affidavit Brandon had just arrogantly signed during our mediation, and forwarded the entire package directly to a contact I had at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division. I flagged it for immediate review, knowing the combination of wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and perjury was a prosecutor's absolute dream. While the federal government quietly began processing the warrants that would end his life as a free man, Brandon was busy celebrating his perceived victory. My private security team, who had been keeping a discreet eye on my family's movements, sent me a real-time update. Completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs locking onto them, Brandon, Keisha, David, and Susan had descended upon the highest-end luxury boutiques in Bal Harbour. Believing that Vanguard Elite was about to hand them $50 million in cash on Friday, they were currently maxing out the absolute last of Keisha's fraudulently obtained high-interest credit cards. They were gleefully purchasing custom-tailored Italian suits, diamond-encrusted watches, and designer gowns. They were aggressively swiping stolen credit to look like untouchable billionaires for their big corporate acquisition meeting, completely unaware that they were enthusiastically financing their own funeral. Friday morning broke with a crisp, clear sky that perfectly mirrored the absolute clarity in my mind. The day of the highly anticipated $50 million acquisition pitch had finally arrived. I arrived at the Vanguard Elite headquarters 3 hours before the scheduled meeting, making sure every single piece of my operation was locked into place. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom, looking down at the city streets far below, waiting for the final act of this incredibly toxic play to begin. Down in the grand sweeping marble lobby of the Vanguard Elite skyscraper, the performance of a lifetime was unfolding. My private security team monitored the live camera feeds and fed the audio directly to the earpiece I wore. I listened with a mixture of disgust and cold fascination as Brandon, Keisha, David, and Susan pushed their way through the heavy revolving glass doors. They were a walking, talking display of fraudulent wealth. Brandon was suffocating in a brightly colored, overly tailored Italian suit that screamed new money desperation. Keisha strutted beside him in a designer gown that was entirely inappropriate for a morning corporate meeting, clutching a diamond-encrusted handbag that she had fraudulently financed just hours prior. My parents flanked them draped in brand-new resort wear, their noses pointed so high in the air, it was a miracle they did not trip over the polished marble floors. They marched straight past the designated visitor waiting area and approached the main reception desk with staggering arrogance. Brandon did not bother to offer a greeting. Instead, he aggressively snapped his fingers at the head receptionist, a highly trained professional who had been briefed on exactly how to handle this specific group. Brandon slammed his hands on the reception counter and loudly announced that he was the founder of the revolutionary logistics company they were acquiring today. He demanded to be taken to the chief executive officer, immediately boasting in a voice loud enough to echo across the entire lobby that by the end of the day, his signature would practically own the building. Keisha chimed in, leaning over the counter to sneer at the receptionist. She criticized the floral arrangements in the lobby and arrogantly stated that once her husband took over the executive board, they would be replacing the front desk staff with people who actually knew how to show proper respect to billionaires. She even had the absolute audacity to demand that someone fetch her a specific brand of imported sparkling water while they waited. Susan laughed, her signature, high-pitched, condescending laugh, loudly agreeing that the current staff looked entirely too pedestrian for a building of this caliber. The receptionist, maintaining flawless corporate composure, simply smiled politely. She handed them their visitor badges and signaled for the executive security detail. Two towering guards in dark suits stepped forward to escort them to the private VIP elevator bank. My family treated the guards like personal servants barking orders about not scuffing their new designer shoes as they were ushered past the metal detectors. I listened to the audio feed as the glass-enclosed elevator rapidly ascended 50 floors. The enclosed space was filled with their giddy, malicious excitement. David clapped Brandon on the shoulder, proudly declaring that this was the moment the family finally cemented its legacy. Susan was already fantasizing aloud about buying a massive luxury yacht to parade in front of the members at the Coral Gables Country Club. But it was Brandon's voice that sent a chill down my spine. He laughed, promising his father that once the $50 million wire transfer cleared their very first order of business, would be completely destroying my pathetic little consulting firm just for the fun of it. He wanted to drive me into such deep bankruptcy that I would have to come crawling back to them on my hands and knees begging for a minimum wage job. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the ultra-modern soundproofed executive wing of Vanguard Elite. The security guards silently guided them down the plush carpeted hallway toward the primary boardroom. The sheer scale of the corporate power surrounding them seemed to finally quiet their loud boasting, replacing it with a greedy, breathless anticipation. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom were opened for them. They stepped inside and the security guards immediately stepped back out, pulling the heavy doors shut. The electronic locks engaged with a heavy, definitive click that echoed through the massive room. The boardroom was intimidating by design. A sprawling 30-foot solid mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed imported leather chairs. The walls were lined with digital monitors and sweeping views of the financial district. My family eagerly took their seats on one side of the massive table. They began pouring themselves glasses of water from the crystal pitchers, whispering excitedly about the luxurious setup and the unbelievable fortune that was about to be handed to them. I was already in the room with them. I was sitting in the dominant, oversized executive chair positioned at the absolute head of the mahogany table. However, the chair was currently swiveled around, facing the panoramic windows, presenting only its high leather back to the room. I sat there in complete predatory silence, listening to the sound of my family settling into their seats, utterly unaware that the elusive chief executive officer they were waiting for was sitting less than 15 feet away. In the quiet hum of the air-conditioned room, my personal cell phone resting face up on the desk in front of me suddenly vibrated silently, the screen illuminated with a new text message. I glanced down. It was from David. Sitting just a few yards behind me, my father had decided to use the final minutes before his son's supposed multi-million-dollar triumph to deliver one last venomous strike against the daughter he despised. The text message was brief, entirely unprovoked, and dripping with absolute malice. It simply read, "You are about to be homeless. Start packing your cheap clothes." I stared at the glowing words on the screen. The sheer relentless cruelty of the message washed over me instantly, solidifying every single decision I had made over the past week. Any lingering microscopic shred of familial guilt I might have subconsciously carried completely evaporated in that exact second. My father wanted to make sure I felt terrified and broken while he celebrated. He wanted to twist the knife. I slowly placed my phone face down on the desk. I interlaced my fingers, resting my elbows on the armrests of the heavy leather chair. I took one final deep breath, letting the absolute certainty of my power settle into my bones. I was wearing a flawlessly tailored razor-sharp charcoal suit. My posture was perfect. My mind was completely clear. The silence in the boardroom stretched on for another agonizing minute. I could hear Keisha whispering impatiently, asking Brandon what was taking the executive team so long to arrive. Brandon confidently murmured back that these high-level corporate types always made you wait to establish dominance, and that they just needed to sit tight and look successful. I decided they had waited long enough. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I pushed my foot against the floor. The heavy, high-backed leather executive chair slowly began to swivel around. The quiet squeak of the rotating mechanism immediately caught their attention. The whispering abruptly stopped. I heard the clinking of a crystal glass being set down onto the mahogany table. The chair completed its rotation, bringing me directly into the center of their field of vision. I sat perfectly still at the head of the boardroom table, my fingers steepled together, my expression carved from solid ice. I made deliberate, piercing eye contact with every single person sitting across from me. First Keisha, whose jaw practically unhinged, then Susan, whose eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. Then David, whose smug, arrogant posture instantly crumbled into paralyzing shock. And finally Brandon, who looked as if all the oxygen had just been violently sucked out of the room. I let the suffocating, absolute silence stretch for 3 long, agonizing seconds before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, powerful, and utterly devoid of any mercy. "Welcome to Vanguard Elite," I said. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was not just a quiet pause. It was a suffocating, paralyzing vacuum where all the air had been violently sucked out of the room. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany table, watching the psychological impact of my presence wash over the 4 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. David stared at me with his mouth slightly open. His jaw had practically unhinged, dropping so far it was almost comical. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting to the massive Vanguard Elite logo etched into the frosted glass walls. Then back to me, desperately trying to make his brain process a reality that fundamentally broke his entire worldview. Susan let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The heavy gold bracelets she had bought with my stolen money clinked loudly against each other in the dead silence. Keisha looked as though she had just seen a ghost, her posture stiffening in her chair as her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. But it was Brandon who provided the most pathetic reaction. His massive, fragile ego simply refused to accept the visual evidence right in front of him. His brain aggressively rejected the idea that the sister he had just evicted was sitting at the pinnacle of the financial empire he was trying to infiltrate. Brandon let out a strained, high-pitched chuckle that echoed awkwardly across the long table. He aggressively adjusted the collar of his garish custom suit, trying to project a dominance he had already completely lost. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded to know what kind of sick joke this was. He told me to stop playing pretend in the executive suite. He sneered, his voice cracking slightly, and ordered me to get up out of the big chair, stop acting like a glorified secretary, and go fetch the real chief executive officer before he had me fired for gross insubordination. He actually believed I had somehow snuck into the boardroom just to pull a prank on him right before his big meeting. He threatened to call security and have me physically dragged out of the building. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a dramatic villain monologue. I simply reached under the lip of the heavy mahogany desk and pressed a concealed silver button. A loud, definitive electronic buzz echoed through the executive suite. The heavy reinforced glass doors at the back of the boardroom engaged with a solid metallic slam. The electronic security locks slid into place, effectively sealing the room. We were completely locked in. Nobody was getting out until I decided this meeting was over. I looked directly into my brother's terrified, sweat-beaded face. I kept my voice entirely stripped of emotion, delivering the words with the cold, absolute precision of a judge handing down a life sentence. I told him there was no one else coming through those doors. I stated clearly that I was the founder, the majority shareholder, and the sole chief executive officer of Vanguard Elite. I explained that I was the one who authorized the acquisition meeting, I was the one who owned the building, and I was the one who controlled his entire future. The realization finally slammed into David. My father slumped back into his leather chair, the blood completely draining from his face as the pieces horrifyingly clicked together. The sudden cancellation of the auto drafts, the targeted purchase of their foreclosed mortgage, the repossession of his luxury vehicle right outside the country club window. He finally understood that he had not just been dealing with a rebellious daughter. He had declared war on a corporate titan, and he had handed me all the ammunition. Brandon's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The reality of my wealth and power was suffocating him, but his greed was still desperately trying to override his panic. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He forced a pathetic, trembling smile onto his face. He actually tried to pivot. He stammered out that if I was really the head of the acquisition firm, then we could keep this $50 million deal in the family. He told me to stop playing games and just bring out the acquisition paperwork so he could sign over his logistics company and they could get their payout. He was still arrogantly demanding his multi-million-dollar check. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair. I picked up a sleek black presentation remote resting next to my keyboard. I told Brandon that we were definitely going to review some paperwork, but it was not going to be a term sheet. I pressed a button on the remote. The recessed lighting in the ceiling of the boardroom automatically dimmed. A mechanical hum filled the silent room as a massive theater-sized projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling directly behind my chair. Brandon sat forward, his greedy eyes practically glowing in the dim light, fully expecting to see a corporate slide deck outlining a $50 million wire transfer. Susan and David leaned in, holding their breath, still desperately hoping this was all just an elaborate negotiation tactic. I clicked the remote a second time. A high-definition state-of-the-art laser projector illuminated the massive screen behind me. There was no acquisition contract. There were no financial projections. Instead, the screen was split perfectly down the middle. On the left side, magnified to 10 feet tall for everyone in the room to read clearly, was a high-resolution scan of the sworn notarized affidavit Brandon had aggressively signed at the law office just 24 hours prior. His flamboyant signature was blown up in massive detail right beneath the legal clause, stating under penalty of federal perjury that he was the sole exclusive creator of the logistics software and that he had received absolutely zero outside assistance in writing the code. On the right side of the screen was a highly complex digital footprint report. It showed the raw source code of the exact supply chain algorithm he had submitted in his pitch deck. But overlaid on top of the code were the unalterable metadata tags, the developer server logs, and the encrypted digital signatures. I let the images burn into their retinas for a long, agonizing moment. Then I began walking them through the data. I pointed to the right side of the screen and read aloud the timestamp on the original creation logs. The dates clearly showed that every single line of that proprietary code had been written, tested, and legally copyrighted by me 4 entire years before Brandon had even registered his fraudulent shell company. I watched Brandon's chest stop moving. He was not breathing. The smug, arrogant entrepreneur facade completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, cornered thief who had just realized the fatal magnitude of his own hubris. I told my brother that he had not just brought stolen intellectual property into a federal financial institution. He had legally sworn to it under oath. I had lured him into a formal legal mediation, stroked his pathetic ego, and happily let him sign a legally binding confession to felony perjury and corporate espionage. The absolute devastation in the boardroom was palpable. They were trapped in a locked room staring at the indisputable proof of their own criminal destruction, and the presentation was only just beginning. Before my brother could even fully process the reality of his stolen code being exposed, I raised the presentation remote and pressed the forward button a second time. The massive projector screen behind me went entirely black for a fraction of a second before flashing to life with a brand new video file. It was not a financial chart. It was the ultra-high-definition 4,000-pixel security footage pulled directly from the concealed cameras inside my private executive suite. The hidden microphones in my office ceiling were state-of-the-art, designed to capture every single whisper in crystal-clear, uncompressed audio. That flawless audio now boomed through the sophisticated surround sound speakers of the locked boardroom. Everyone at the mahogany table jumped as Keisha's recorded voice suddenly echoed off the glass walls. On the massive screen, a digital version of Keisha aggressively marched into my office, her designer handbag swinging as she slammed her hands flat onto my walnut desk. The real Keisha, sitting just a few feet away from me, physically recoiled. All the haughty, elite superiority she had projected when she walked into the building vanished instantly. She stared up at her own digital face in absolute, unadulterated horror. The video played in excruciating detail. The entire room watched in dead silence as the recorded version of Keisha pulled out the fabricated, wrinkled copy of our late grandfather's supposed will. Her threatening voice filled the boardroom, explicitly laying out her extortion demands. She aggressively demanded that I sign over the deed to the Miami mansion and drop the eviction notice against my parents. She loudly promised that if I refused, she would take the forged documents straight to the financial press to orchestrate a massive scandal and destroy my company's reputation right before a quarterly earnings report. The recording captured the very essence of a federal blackmail felony wrapped up in a neat, undeniable bow. It showed my calculated fake panic attack. It showed Keisha triumphantly snatching the signed receipt and strutting out of the office like a conquering queen. When the video finally ended, the final frame froze on Keisha's smug, victorious smile towering 10 feet tall above us all. The atmosphere in the boardroom fractured entirely. Up until this exact moment, David and Susan had desperately clung to the hope that this was merely an intellectual property dispute. They thought this was a civil matter, a corporate argument over software ownership that could somehow be swept under the rug or settled with a nasty lawsuit. But extortion, blackmail, and forging legal documents to steal real estate were not civil disputes. They were federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. The sheer gravity of the situation finally broke my parents. The fragile, toxic alliance they had built with Brandon and Keisha disintegrated right in front of my eyes. David leaped out of his imported leather chair so fast that it tipped backward and crashed into the glass wall behind him. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at Brandon, his face twisting with a mixture of terror and furious self-preservation. My father began screaming that he had absolutely no idea about any forged will or any extortion plots. He wildly claimed that Brandon had completely brainwashed them. He swore up and down that he and Susan were innocent elderly victims who had been manipulated by a deceitful, greedy son. Susan did not even bother to stand up. She completely collapsed, sliding out of her chair until she was literally on her knees on the plush boardroom carpet. She crawled toward my end of the massive mahogany table, her expensive resort wear bunching up around her ankles. She clutched the edge of the polished wood, sobbing hysterically, begging me for mercy. She wailed that Brandon had poisoned their minds against me, crying that they were just desperate parents trying to support a child they thought was building a legitimate business. In the span of 30 seconds, David and Susan brutally and completely threw their beloved golden child straight under the bus to save their own skin. Brandon sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting frantically between his sobbing mother, his screaming father, and the frozen image of his wife committing a federal crime on the projector screen. He tried to open his mouth to defend himself, to spin another elaborate lie, but his voice completely failed him. The undeniable audio evidence booming through the room had stripped away every single defense mechanism he possessed. He was utterly trapped, watching his parents eagerly offer him up as a sacrificial lamb. I watched my parents grovel and shift the blame, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. I did not acknowledge Susan's tears. I did not validate David's frantic excuses. I simply looked at Brandon, who was currently sweating through his brightly colored, expensive Italian suit, and then I turned my attention directly to Keisha. She was gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly, her knuckles had turned completely white. Her chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She knew she had been caught dead to rights committing extortion, but she had absolutely no idea that the nightmare was about to get infinitely worse. I raised the presentation remote one last time. I firmly pressed the button, advancing the projector to the final, most devastating slide of the morning. The frozen security footage vanished. In its place, a dense, complicated web of highly classified financial documents materialized on the screen. The slide was packed with Internal Revenue Service tax filings, corporate charter registrations from Delaware and Nevada, and high-interest commercial loan applications. I did not need to explain the complex financial architecture of the fraud to the room. I had instructed my forensic accountants to make the visual evidence incredibly simple to understand. Across every single document, every fraudulent loan application, and every single corporate tax evasion, filing one specific piece of data was highlighted in a blinding neon yellow marker. It was Keisha's personal social security number. I watched Keisha's eyes scan the documents. Her confusion lasted only a brief second before it was entirely violently replaced by pure comprehension. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table, and locked my eyes directly onto my sister-in-law. I kept my voice deadly quiet, ensuring that every single word sliced through the chaotic noise of my parents' frantic begging. I asked Keisha if she was aware that her brilliant visionary husband had completely ruined his own personal credit years ago. I calmly explained that in order to fund his pathetic illusion of a billionaire lifestyle, Brandon had secretly stolen her identity. I told her that he had used her pristine credit history and her social security number to open multiple phantom shell companies without her knowledge. He had forged her signature to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent business loans and actively evaded corporate taxes. I watched the devastating reality shatter Keisha's entire world. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered the final fatal blow. I asked her if she knew she was facing 20 years in federal prison for the loans her husband took out in her name. Keisha stopped breathing. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the executive boardroom was the quiet hum of the projector fan. She stared at the highlighted digits of her own social security number, glowing on the massive screen. She looked at the fraudulent corporate loan applications bearing her perfectly forged signature. The gravity of federal tax evasion and identity theft crashed down on her all at once. Brandon had not just lied to her about his wealth. He had actively maliciously set her up as the ultimate fall guy. If the shell companies collapsed, he would walk away completely clean while she took the absolute brunt of the federal indictments. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Brandon was visibly sweating, shrinking down into his expensive Italian suit. He held up his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture and whispered for her to calm down. He promised they could fix this if she just kept her mouth shut. The sheer audacity of his demand was the final spark that ignited a powder keg. Keisha did not just stand up. She launched herself out of the leather chair. She drew her hand back and slapped Brandon across the face with such explosive, unrestrained violence that the impact echoed through the glass-walled room like a gunshot. Brandon's head snapped to the side. He let out a sharp cry of pain, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek as he nearly toppled out of his seat. David and Susan shrieked in horror, but Keisha completely ignored them. She leaned over her husband, her voice shaking with raw, unadulterated fury. She screamed that he had ruined her life. She shouted that he was a pathetic broke fraud who used her name to commit federal felonies. Brandon panicked. The carefully constructed illusion of his billionaire status was dead, and now his own wife was unraveling his legal defense in front of the person he had tried to destroy. He aggressively grabbed Keisha by the wrist, pulling her down toward him. He hissed through gritted teeth, ordering her to shut up, demanding that she stop handing me evidence and play along until they could get out of the building. Keisha violently wrenched her arm out of his grasp. She looked at him with pure, venomous disgust. She told him she was not going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for a man who could not even afford his own car payments. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her manicured fingers flew across the screen as she unlocked the device and opened a specific, heavily archived text message thread. She slammed the phone face up onto the polished mahogany and forcefully slid it all the way across the long table. It stopped mere inches from my folded hands. I picked up the glowing device. Keisha told me to read the messages out loud. She announced to the room that if Brandon was willing to throw his own wife into a federal prison cell to protect his fake empire, then she was perfectly willing to burn his entire life to the ground. I looked down at the screen. The text messages were between Brandon and Keisha, dated just 3 weeks prior, right after they had violently kicked me out of the Miami mansion. The level of sociopathic calculation in his own words was staggering. I cleared my throat and began to read his explicit, detailed plans to the silent room. In the messages, Brandon clearly outlined his ultimate endgame for the Vanguard elite acquisition money. He had absolutely zero intention of taking care of David and Susan. I read aloud as Brandon proudly explained how he was going to manipulate our parents into signing over their remaining retirement accounts and power of attorney to him. Once he had total control of their meager remaining assets, he explicitly detailed his plan to stick them in the cheapest, lowest-rated state-run nursing home he could find. He texted Keisha that our parents were nothing but gullible, pathetic cash cows who had outlived their usefulness. He promised his wife that once he bled David and Susan completely dry, he would cut all contact with them and move to a private island, leaving them to rot in squalor. The reaction from my parents was absolute catastrophic devastation. This was not a business dispute. This was the utter annihilation of their entire reality. David clutched his chest, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he stared at the golden child he had sacrificed everything to protect. Susan let out a guttural, heartbroken wail. She covered her ears, rocking back and forth in her chair, physically incapable of processing the fact that the son she had idolized, the son she had chosen over me, viewed her as nothing more than a disposable piece of trash to be exploited and discarded. They had thrown away a loyal, successful daughter for a vicious parasite who was actively plotting their miserable demise. Brandon buried his face in his hands, completely defeated. There were no more lies to spin, no more arrogant boasts to make. He was exposed as a fraud, a thief, and a traitor to his own blood. Keisha did not waste a single second looking at her ruined husband or her sobbing in-laws. She turned her entire focus directly to me. All of her previous high society arrogance, the mocking cruelty she had displayed on the front lawn, was entirely gone. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white, and dropped all pretense of pride. She begged me for a corporate plea deal. She frantically promised that if I protected her from the federal wire fraud and tax evasion charges, she would hand over absolutely everything. She offered to turn state evidence against Brandon. She promised to provide the passwords to his encrypted laptops, the locations of his hidden offshore gambling accounts, and testify in open court that he had deliberately orchestrated the entire intellectual property theft. She pleaded with me, tears streaming down her face, swearing she would do whatever it took to avoid going to federal prison. I sat back in my high-backed leather executive chair, holding her unlocked phone in my hand. I looked at the broken, weeping remnants of my toxic family surrounding the massive boardroom table. I held absolute total power over every single aspect of their futures. I took a slow, deep breath, opening my mouth to deliver my final verdict on Keisha's desperate offer. But before a single syllable could leave my lips, the heavy, secure atmosphere of the room was violently interrupted. A harsh electronic buzzing sound erupted from the back of the suite. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom, which I had securely locked from my desk console, suddenly clicked. The reinforced deadbolts aggressively disengaged from the outside, and the massive doors swung wide open. 3 federal agents in sharp, dark suits stepped into the boardroom, moving with calculated and undeniable authority. They were closely flanked by my own Vanguard elite corporate security team. The agents completely ignored the frantic sobbing of my parents and bypassed Keisha entirely. They marched straight toward the side of the mahogany table, where my brother sat paralyzed in his expensive Italian suit. The lead agent flashed his badge and addressed Brandon by his full legal name. He did not lower his voice or offer any professional courtesy. He loudly and clearly read Brandon his Miranda rights right there in the middle of my executive suite. Before my brother could even attempt to stammer out a defense or spin another pathetic lie, the agents grabbed his arms, pulled them aggressively behind his back, and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed off the glass walls. The lead agent formally announced that Brandon was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and perjury. Brandon's legs completely gave out. If the 2 federal agents had not been holding him up by his arms, he would have collapsed flat onto the floor. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting to Keisha, who simply turned her head away in absolute disgust. He then looked at my parents, his face a portrait of sheer, unadulterated terror, as the reality of a federal prison sentence finally crushed his billionaire delusion. The sight of their golden child being hauled away in handcuffs absolutely broke David and Susan. The final microscopic fragments of their elite high society facade instantly evaporated. My parents, the same arrogant people who had proudly tossed my belongings onto the sidewalk and mocked my existence, literally threw themselves out of their leather chairs. They collapsed onto the plush boardroom carpet and crawled frantically toward my side of the desk. Susan threw her arms around my legs, her tears soaking directly into the fabric of my tailored skirt. David fell to his knees right beside her, his hands desperately grasping at the hem of my jacket. They completely abandoned their pride and wailed hysterically. They sobbed out frantic, pathetic apologies for the past 30 years of neglect. They cried that they had been foolish and blind. They begged me to use my massive corporate wealth and my high-level connections to fix this nightmare. They pleaded with me to pay his bail hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country and save their precious son from spending decades in a federal penitentiary. I did not flinch. I did not step back or try to pull my skirt out of their frantic, grasping hands. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair and looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. My eyes were entirely devoid of sympathy, replaced by absolute glacial ice. I waited for them to pause to catch their breath. When the room fell quiet enough for my voice to carry, I delivered the final fatal blow. I looked directly into my father's panicked, tear-streaked face and repeated the exact words he had sent me just a few days prior. I told him we needed to keep our distance and asked him to please not contact me anymore. Susan let out a devastated, breathless gasp as the realization of my total rejection hit her. They had burned the only bridge that could have possibly saved them. I looked up from my parents and made eye contact with my head of corporate security standing near the doorway. I gestured dismissively toward the two sobbing figures on the floor. I firmly instructed my security team to please escort these strangers out of my building. 3 weeks later, the unyielding machinery of the legal system arrived at the heavy iron gates of the Miami mansion. The eviction notice I had served them had officially expired, and the county sheriffs were not interested in hearing any more of my parents' fabricated excuses. I received real-time updates from my property management team as the final humiliating act of their high society facade came crashing down. David and Susan were forcibly removed from the sprawling estate they had pretended to own. Because their bank accounts remained entirely frozen and their credit was completely obliterated, they could not afford to hire a professional moving company. They could not even afford to buy proper cardboard moving boxes. Instead, the elite status-obsessed couple was reduced to frantically shoving their remaining designer clothes, expensive shoes, and personal items into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags under the stern, watchful eyes of two armed law enforcement officers. To make the morning even more devastating, a courier had arrived at the gate just moments before the sheriffs. The messenger handed David a formally drafted legal letter from the Coral Gables Country Club. The board of directors had voted unanimously to permanently revoke their membership and strictly blacklist them from the premises. The news of Brandon's explosive federal arrest and their horrific attempt to extort their own daughter had spread through the Miami elite like wildfire. In the span of 21 days, my parents had transitioned from self-proclaimed billionaires to absolute social pariahs. Standing on the sweltering concrete sidewalk surrounded by garbage bags filled with wrinkled silk and linen, David pulled out his prepaid cell phone. I was told he spent over an hour frantically dialing every single extended family member, former business associate, and country club acquaintance in his contacts list. He desperately begged for a temporary place to stay, trying to spin a pathetic narrative about a temporary cash flow issue and a massive misunderstanding. Nobody took the bait. Most of his calls went straight to voicemail. The few relatives who actually answered the phone immediately hung up the second they heard his voice. The entire community had seen the financial fallout and read the public filings regarding the federal indictments. No one was willing to harbor accessories to corporate fraud. They were entirely, utterly radioactive. With the blazing afternoon sun beating down on them, my parents were forced to cram their black trash bags into the back seat of a cramped, dented economy rental car. They drove away from the pristine palm tree-lined streets of their former neighborhood heading straight for the industrial neglected outskirts of the city. With their severely limited remaining cash, they had no choice but to check into a rundown roadside motel that charged by the week. The property was flanked by a noisy highway and a flickering, half-broken neon vacancy sign. Their new reality was a cramped, dingy room that smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh chemical bleach. There were no imported rugs, no crystal chandeliers, and no catered meals. Just a sagging mattress, peeling wallpaper, and the suffocating weight of their own catastrophic life choices. But even stripped of her wealth and banished to the absolute bottom of the social ladder, Susan refused to accept defeat. Her toxic ego simply could not process the fact that she had permanently lost the game. She still believed she could pull my strings if she just applied the right amount of emotional pressure. Sitting at a wobbly, stained laminate desk in the corner of the gloomy motel room, my mother decided to launch one final desperate psychological attack. She found a cheap pad of motel stationery in the drawer, took out a pen, and began to write. She did not write an apology for aiding in the theft of my intellectual property. She did not express a single ounce of remorse for abandoning me or treating me like a complete failure for my entire adult life. Instead, she crafted a highly calculated theatrical manipulation. She forced herself to cry deliberately, letting her tears fall and smear the ink on the cheap paper to make the document look as tragic and desperate as possible. In the handwritten letter, Susan declared that her heart was completely broken by my supposed cruelty. She wrote that the pain of my ungrateful rejection was simply too much for a loving mother to bear. She formally announced that she was initiating a complete, absolute hunger strike. She threatened to sit on that sagging motel bed and refuse to eat a single bite of food, swearing she would willingly let herself starve to death unless I immediately came to my senses, drove to the motel, and spoke to them in person. The heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at my penthouse, mixed in with a stack of quarterly financial reports. The return address was a cheap motel on the absolute edge of the city limits, written in my mother's unmistakable, frantic handwriting. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, and sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Susan had pulled out all the stops. The cheap motel stationery was literally warped and stained with her dried tears. She had written pages of dramatic, victimized prose wailing about how her heart was giving out from the pain of my betrayal. But the absolute climax of her performance was the grand ultimatum at the bottom of the second page. She formally announced that she was initiating a strict, indefinite hunger strike. She swore to God that she would sit on her motel bed and starve herself to death unless I drove down there, looked her in the eyes, and begged for her forgiveness. A few years ago, a letter like that would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have dropped everything, rushed to her side, and emptied my bank accounts just to make her stop crying. Today, I did not even blink. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt, anger, or sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but clinical boredom. I walked away from the window, stepped over to the heavy-duty paper shredder, humming quietly next to my mahogany desk, and dropped the tear-stained pages directly into the mechanical teeth. The machine whirred to life instantly, grinding my mother's ultimate psychological weapon into tiny, meaningless strips of confetti. I took a sip of my coffee, sat down in my ergonomic chair, and immediately went back to reviewing a highly complex international acquisition deal involving a European supply chain firm. My parents were officially erased from my reality. While I was finalizing multi-million-dollar international mergers, my sister-in-law was experiencing an entirely different kind of corporate restructuring. Keisha was currently navigating the absolute most brutal, humiliating divorce proceedings imaginable. She was desperately trying to sever all legal ties to Brandon before his federal trial date arrived, hoping to convince the prosecutors that she was just an innocent, naive wife who had been tricked into signing those fraudulent loan applications. To avoid joining her husband in a federal penitentiary, Keisha had to fully cooperate with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was forced to sit in sterile, windowless interrogation rooms for hours on end, turning over every single password, bank record, and encrypted file Brandon had ever tried to hide. But cooperating with the government did not pay her legal bills. Because her assets were tied to Brandon's frozen accounts, Keisha was completely, utterly broke. The woman who had proudly strutted across my parents' lawn, mocking my clothes and bragging about her elite status, was now fighting for her basic survival. To afford even the cheapest, lowest-tier defense attorney in the city, she had to liquidate her entire fake identity. My private security team reported that Keisha was spending her weekends hauling her massive collection of luxury designer handbags, diamond tennis watches, and imported shoes to high-end pawn shops and consignment stores. She had to stand at the counter and watch as clerks offered her pennies on the dollar for items she had bought using my stolen money. The absolute humiliation of haggling over the resale value of a purse just to keep herself out of a jail cell was tearing her apart. Her flawless high society facade had completely rotted away, leaving behind a desperate woman backed into a terrifying legal corner. The crushing weight of her mounting legal debt eventually pushed Keisha to a breaking point. She realized that flipping used designer bags was not going to cover the massive retainer her cheap lawyer was demanding. In a sheer act of unadulterated desperation, she decided to try and play the family card one last time. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Keisha actually showed up at the towering glass entrance of the Vanguard Elite skyscraper. She was no longer wearing a clinging silk dress or oversized designer sunglasses. She arrived looking haggard and utterly exhausted, wearing a basic trench coat and practical shoes. Her grand plan was to bluff her way into my lobby, ride the elevator up to my penthouse, and personally drop to her knees in front of my desk. She intended to beg me for a minimum wage job in my mailroom, a custodial position, absolutely anything that would give her a paycheck to cover her legal fees. She truly believed that because we had once shared family dinners, I might take pity on her. She walked through the heavy revolving doors, took a deep breath, and marched toward the main reception desk. She never even made it halfway across the marble lobby. Two massive, broad-shouldered corporate security guards immediately stepped out from behind the marble pillars, completely blocking her path. Keisha tried to put on a brave face, nervously stating that she was the chief executive officer's sister-in-law and that she was there for a personal family meeting. The head of security did not smile. He did not ask her to take a seat in the waiting area. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a thick, legally binding document stamped with an official county seal. He stepped forward and firmly pressed the paperwork directly against Keisha's chest. He loudly and clearly informed her that she had just been officially served. Keisha looked down at the document in absolute horror. It was not a job application. It was a permanent, non-negotiable restraining order personally signed by me and approved by a federal judge. The head of security coldly instructed her to turn around and exit the building immediately, warning her that if she ever came within 500 feet of Vanguard Elite or my personal residence ever again, she would be thrown in the back of a police cruiser and hit with a severe violation of a court order, which would completely destroy her pending federal plea deal. 3 months evaporated into the humid Florida summer. The relentless wheels of the federal justice system finally ground my brother down to absolutely nothing. The trial of the year, at least for the local financial press, began on a muggy Tuesday morning. I received a federal subpoena to testify as a key witness for the prosecution. In the past, the mere thought of being forced into a room with my toxic family would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. But I was no longer the vulnerable daughter they had thrown onto the sidewalk. My world-class legal team immediately filed a series of protective motions. They argued successfully that my physical presence in the courtroom was entirely unnecessary and potentially disruptive given the documented extortion attempts and the severe emotional distress my family had inflicted upon me. The judge agreed. Instead of taking the stand and subjecting myself to cross-examination, I was permitted to provide a devastatingly thorough written testimony. I submitted a sworn affidavit detailing exactly how my intellectual property was stolen from a plastic storage bin on a public street. My lawyers handed over the copyrighted source code, the undeniable digital timestamps, and the highly encrypted server logs proving my sole ownership. I did not even have to look at my family. I stayed in the pristine, air-conditioned sanctuary of my Vanguard Elite penthouse reviewing the court transcripts as they were securely delivered to my private server by a legal liaison I had planted in the gallery. The descriptions painted a pathetic, entirely broken picture. Brandon, the self-proclaimed tech billionaire who used to strut around in custom Italian suits, sat at the defense table, looking completely hollowed out. Without the fabricated backing of my investment firm, his terrifying financial reality was exposed to the world. He could not afford a high-priced, aggressive defense attorney. He was represented by an exhausted, heavily overworked public defender who was entirely buried under the massive mountain of evidence the Federal Bureau of Investigation had compiled. Brandon had lost a significant amount of weight. His face was gaunt, his shoulders slumped forward, and the arrogant, superior smirk that had defined his entire personality was completely erased. In its place was sheer paralyzing terror. He jumped every time the heavy courtroom doors opened. He was a cornered rat who finally realized there was no escape hatch. Sitting right behind him in the stark wooden gallery were David and Susan. The daily reports from my legal liaison detailed exactly how rapidly my parents had aged in just 90 days. The crushing stress of poverty and severe public humiliation had violently stripped away their elite high society facade. Susan wore a faded out-of-season dress. Her expensive hair coloring had grown out, showing stark gray roots, and her heavy gold jewelry was long gone, likely pawned to pay for basic groceries and cheap motel rent. David sat beside her with his head bowed, looking like a frail, utterly defeated man. They were forced to sit in that cold courtroom day after grueling day and listen as ruthless federal prosecutors meticulously laid out exactly how their precious golden child had orchestrated a massive criminal syndicate. They had to sit in silence as the government played the crystal-clear audio recordings of Brandon mocking them, calling them gullible cash cows and detailing his explicit plans to dump them in a miserable state-run nursing home once he stole their remaining assets. The brutal reality finally shattered their lifelong delusion. They had to face the undeniable truth that the son they idolized, the son they had proudly chosen over a loyal and successful daughter, viewed them as nothing more than disposable collateral. The trial itself was an absolute slaughter. The prosecution played the 4,000-pixel security footage from my office showing the blatant extortion attempt in high definition. They displayed the shell company registrations featuring the stolen Social Security number. They brought in forensic accountants who traced every single stolen dollar directly back to Brandon's offshore gambling accounts. There was no viable defense. Brandon's public defender could barely mount a cross-examination against the staggering weight of the digital evidence. The paper trail was flawless, and the sworn perjury affidavit Brandon had arrogantly signed in the mediation room was the ultimate nail in his coffin. The final day of the trial brought the ultimate reckoning. The federal judge, a stern man who had absolutely zero patience for white-collar criminals who exploited their own families, looked down from the bench with total disgust. I sat at my mahogany desk watching the live text updates roll in from my liaison sitting in the courtroom. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. It was not a difficult decision. The foreman stood up holding the verdict sheet and read the findings aloud to the dead silent room. Guilty of wire fraud. Guilty of aggravated identity theft. Guilty of federal tax evasion. Guilty of corporate espionage. Guilty of perjury. The word guilty struck the courtroom over and over again like physical blows. Brandon completely broke down. He collapsed forward onto the defense table, sobbing hysterically, begging the judge for a lenient sentence. He cried that he was just a desperate entrepreneur who made a few bad choices, pleading for a second chance to make things right. But the judge was merciless. He looked directly at Brandon and cited the calculated sociopathic cruelty of the crimes. He pointed out the malicious exploitation of a spouse, the attempted theft of a sister's life work, and the complete staggering lack of remorse shown until the handcuffs clicked shut. The heavy wooden gavel came down with a deafening crack that echoed through the courtroom and finalized the destruction of their toxic legacy. Brandon was officially sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The golden child was locked away in a concrete cell, and the inescapable reality of federal prison firmly sealed his fate. With Brandon securely locked behind federal concrete, the true scope of the devastation my parents had brought upon themselves finally materialized. Stripped of their stolen wealth and completely blacklisted from every elite social circle in Miami, David and Susan were violently shoved into the exact kind of working class reality they had spent their entire lives mocking and avoiding. Without my stolen money to fund their delusions, survival became an agonizing daily battle. David, a man who once spent his afternoons drinking imported scotch and throwing lavish brunches at the Coral Gables Country Club, was forced to accept the only job willing to hire a disgraced elderly man tied to a massive federal fraud scandal. He became a front-door greeter at a massive warehouse-style home improvement store. The irony of his new uniform was absolutely suffocating. He was required to wear a stiff, brightly colored polyester vest with a cheap plastic name tag pinned to his chest. He spent 8 to 10 hours a day, standing on an unforgiving concrete floor under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, handing out sanitized shopping carts to the general public. His feet swelled, his back throbbed constantly, and the sheer physical toll of the labor stripped away the arrogant posture he used to wield like a weapon. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torture he endured on Saturday mornings. The hardware store was located just a few miles from the wealthy suburban neighborhoods they used to frequent. Wealthy contractors, local real estate developers, and former golf buddies would routinely stroll through the automatic sliding doors to purchase bulk supplies for their sprawling estates. Whenever David spotted a familiar face from his past life approaching the entrance, sheer panic would overtake him. He would frantically turn his back to the doors, pretending to intensely organize stacks of promotional flyers on a nearby display table. Sometimes he would aggressively cough into his hands, pulling his collar up to hide his face, until the former acquaintances walked past. The crushing, paralyzing embarrassment of being recognized in a minimum wage uniform by the same men he used to boast to entirely broke his spirit. Susan's descent into the working class was arguably even more brutal. The woman who used to loudly complain if a five-star restaurant served her the wrong vintage of champagne was forced to take a grueling night shift position at a commercial industrial laundry facility. She spent her nights in a windowless concrete warehouse, filled with the deafening roar of massive commercial washing machines and suffocating chemical-laced steam. For 8 hours a shift, she hauled heavy soaking wet hotel linens and restaurant tablecloths out of boiling water. The harsh industrial bleach and cheap detergents completely ruined her skin. The perfect expensive manicures she used to flaunt were replaced by cracked, calloused, and constantly peeling hands. The relentless physical labor destroyed her spine. Her shoulders permanently slumped forward, her back ached with every movement, and the haughty superior elegance that used to define her entire existence was scrubbed away by sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Their living situation reflected the absolute ruin of their finances. They were forced to rent a cramped single-room apartment in a highly neglected industrial neighborhood on the very outskirts of the city limits. The walls were paper-thin, allowing them to hear every argument and siren from the streets below. The plumbing constantly leaked, leaving a permanent ring of rust in the chipped porcelain bathtub. When they turned on the single overhead light in the tiny kitchenette, cockroaches would instantly scatter across the peeling linoleum floor. They lived entirely paycheck to paycheck, calculating every single cent just to ensure they could keep the electricity running. The lavish steak dinners, the imported caviar, and the elite country club buffets were replaced entirely by cheap dented cans of generic soup and discounted boxes of dry pasta. The silence in their miserable, stifling apartment was deafening. They were entirely devoid of the elite social circle they had sacrificed my well-being to maintain. They had absolutely no one left to impress, no one left to manipulate, and no one left to blame. The superficial friends they had spent decades cultivating had vanished the second the federal indictments hit the news. The golden child they had idolized was locked in a cage, having proven that he viewed them as nothing more than disposable assets. The absolute unforgiving desolation of their new life finally forced them to confront the massive, undeniable magnitude of what they had thrown away. There was no more manipulation left to play. There was no more leverage, no more fake medical bills, and no more extortion attempts. They had hit the absolute bottom of the barrel, and the impact completely shattered their lifelong delusion of superiority. In a rare moment of undeniable clarity, surrounded by the bleak, humid reality of their roach-infested apartment, my parents managed to scrape together a few extra dollars from their meager, hard-earned paychecks. They did not use the money to buy a lottery ticket, and they did not use it to purchase a cheap bottle of alcohol to numb their miserable reality. Instead, they walked to a local shipping center and purchased a simple cardboard box and basic postage. They returned to their apartment and carefully packed the box with the only items of true lasting value they had left in the entire world. It was a collection of my old childhood photographs. The very same pictures they had once completely neglected, the same memories they had allowed Brandon to violently throw onto the pavement on the day they kicked me out of the mansion. They gathered every single surviving photo of me, carefully wiping away the dust and placing them securely inside the cardboard packaging. Alongside the photographs, they placed a handwritten letter. This time, the letter contained zero demands for cash. It contained zero manipulative threats of a dramatic hunger strike, and it offered zero excuses for their decades of horrific behavior. It was a raw, genuinely broken plea from two people who had lost absolutely everything. They wrote about the blinding regret that consumed them every single day. They acknowledged the pure, undeniable cruelty of their actions and the brilliant, loyal daughter they had callously discarded. They packed the letter, sealed the battered cardboard box with cheap, clear tape, and carried it to the post office. They dropped their final, desperate apology into the mail, asking for nothing but my forgiveness, and sent it into the void. The battered cardboard box took exactly 4 days to travel from the industrial outskirts of Miami to the gleaming glass towers of the financial district. It moved through the highly secure Vanguard Elite mailroom, looking entirely out of place among the stack of embossed corporate envelopes, expedited legal parcels, and international investment portfolios. My executive assistant brought the afternoon mail delivery up to my penthouse suite. She walked into my office carrying a sleek metallic sorting tray. Sitting right in the center of the pristine metal surface was the pathetic, weather-beaten package. My assistant set the tray down on my walnut desk with a hesitant, confused expression. She pointed to the handwritten return address, noting the dilapidated motel name and the familiar family names scrawled in shaky, desperate ink. She politely asked if she should call corporate security to scan the package for safety protocols, or if she should carefully open it for me to inspect the contents. I did not need corporate security to tell me what was hiding inside that box. I recognized my mother's slanted, frantic handwriting instantly. I knew exactly what kind of emotional manipulation they had packed into that cheap cardboard shell. A few years ago, the mere sight of a package from my parents would have sent my heart racing with a desperate, foolish hope that they had finally decided to love me. I would have ripped open the cheap packing tape, eager to find some scrap of affection, a genuine apology, or even just a simple acknowledgement of my existence. But sitting in my high-backed leather chair, surrounded by the corporate empire I had built with my own 2 hands, I looked at the battered box and felt an absolute profound emptiness. There was no anger left to burn. There was no lingering sadness to process. The people who sent that package were complete strangers to me now. They were ghosts from a past life that I had permanently buried. I leaned back in my chair and looked up at my assistant. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of hesitation. I calmly shook my head and told her not to touch the tape. I opened my top desk drawer, pulled out a heavy, self-inking rubber stamp used for misdirected corporate mail, and handed it across the desk. I instructed her to press the stamp directly over my mother's frantic handwriting. I told her to mark it in bold, unforgiving red ink with the words, "Return to sender not at this address." I ordered her to hand the unopened box right back to the postal carrier and permanently flag the return address in our building security system so no future deliveries from them would ever make it past the loading dock. My assistant nodded professionally, firmly stamped the cardboard box with a loud, definitive clack, and carried my parents' final desperate plea right out of my office. 3 days later, the Postal Service delivered the rejected package back to the decaying, roach-infested apartment complex on the edge of the city. David was returning from a grueling 10-hour shift at the hardware store, his feet throbbing and his stiff polyester uniform clinging to his exhausted frame. He checked the rusted, dented metal mailbox in the lobby, out of pure habit, expecting nothing but past-due utility bills. Shoved aggressively into the tiny metal slot was the exact same cardboard box they had meticulously packed and mailed just a week prior. He pulled the package out, his calloused hands shaking as his eyes locked onto the massive, glaring red stamp plastered directly across the front. Not at this address. The bold red letters hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He carried the rejected box up the 3 flights of stairs to their cramped, humid apartment. Susan was sitting at the tiny laminate kitchen table, icing her swollen hands after another brutal night shift at the commercial laundry facility. David did not say a single word. He simply walked over to the table and dropped the unopened red-stamped box directly in front of her. Susan stared at the bright red ink. The fragile, pathetic shred of hope they had been clinging to for the past week instantly evaporated. They had genuinely believed that sending my childhood photographs would magically erase decades of emotional abuse, financial extortion, and betrayal. They thought the visual reminder of a little girl they had once tolerated would melt the ice around my heart and force me to come rushing to their rescue. The unopened box proved that the little girl they were trying to manipulate no longer existed. The absolute finality of their situation crashed down on them, suffocating them in the stifling heat of the tiny apartment. There would be no dramatic reconciliation. There would be no tearful reunion where I handed them the keys to a new mansion and restored their unlimited credit cards. The bridge they had so callously burned was completely reduced to ash, and the ashes had been entirely swept away by the wind. They were completely, utterly abandoned to the consequences of their own toxic greed. They realized with horrifying certainty that they were going to spend the rest of their natural lives trapped in that miserable room, working minimum wage jobs until their bodies gave out, completely forgotten by the daughter they had so proudly thrown away. The box of childhood memories sat unopened on the sticky kitchen table, a permanent monument to their catastrophic failure. Miles away from their crushing despair, the atmosphere in my luxury condominium was electric with anticipation. The sun had set over the Miami skyline, casting a glittering reflection across the dark ocean water. I stood in the center of my expansive walk-in closet, surrounded by soft ambient lighting and floor-to-ceiling mirrors. Tonight was not just another corporate networking event. It was the absolute pinnacle of my professional career. I was preparing to attend the National Young Innovators Gala, the most exclusive, highly publicized business awards ceremony in the country. My styling team had just finished putting my hair into a sleek, commanding updo. I stepped into a flawlessly tailored midnight blue evening gown. The heavy silk draped perfectly over my frame, projecting an image of absolute power, sophistication, and untouchable success. I slipped a pair of understated, brilliant-cut diamond earrings into place, rejecting any flashy, gaudy jewelry that reminded me of my mother's tacky country club aesthetic. I fastened a sleek platinum watch around my wrist, ensuring every single detail of my appearance was meticulously calculated and razor-sharp. I stood before the full-length mirror and looked at the woman reflecting back at me. I adjusted the subtle, elegant cuffs of my gown, letting my hands smooth down the expensive fabric. There was no trace of the terrified, anxious daughter who used to empty her bank accounts just to beg for a scrap of parental affection. The woman in the mirror was a titan. She was a chief executive officer who had outsmarted federal criminals, legally decimated her abusers, and built an absolute empire from the ground up without a single drop of family support. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, and she was entirely unbothered by the ghosts of her past. My private driver sent a secure notification to my phone alerting me that the armored luxury sedan was waiting for me at the private garage entrance. I grabbed my sleek evening clutch, took one final steadying breath, and turned away from the mirror. Tonight, I was going to walk into a grand ballroom filled with the most powerful billionaires, investors, and media moguls in the nation. I was going to stand under the brightest lights, claim my rightful place at the absolute top of the financial hierarchy, and deliver a message that would permanently sever the final lingering thread of my toxic past. I opened the front door and stepped out into the night, ready to claim my empire. The armored sedan glided smoothly through the bustling downtown streets, carrying me away from my quiet penthouse and directly into the epicenter of the city's financial elite. As my driver pulled the vehicle up to the grand entrance of the Civic Center, the humid night air was instantly fractured by the blinding rapid-fire flashes of dozens of press cameras. Reporters called out my company name, microphones were thrust toward the velvet ropes, and the most influential figures in the American business world turned their heads to watch me arrive. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked onto the brilliant crimson carpet with my head held high, acknowledging the flashing bulbs with a calm, measured smile. My midnight blue silk gown draped flawlessly over my frame, projecting an image of absolute untouchable power. Inside the venue, the grand ballroom was an overwhelming display of opulence and high-stakes corporate influence. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of round tables covered in heavy black silk. The room was packed wall to wall with venture capitalists, legendary tech moguls, and the most powerful media executives in the nation. The dull roar of clinking crystal glasses and aggressive networking filled the massive space. I bypassed the crowded lobby and took my designated seat at the center table right in front of the main stage, flanked by my top executives and fiercely loyal board members. The evening progressed through a blur of catered courses and lengthy introductory speeches. Then the master of ceremonies finally stepped up to the main podium. The massive digital screens flanking the stage lit up with the sleek, instantly recognizable Vanguard Elite logo. A respectful hush fell over the sprawling ballroom as the presenter began reading my professional biography to the audience. He detailed the meteoric rise of my consulting firm, the flawless execution of my international supply chain acquisitions, and the staggering financial growth I had orchestrated over the past 5 years. He highlighted the brutal odds I had overcome to secure my place in a fiercely competitive industry. Finally, he leaned into the microphone and officially announced my name, declaring me the National Entrepreneur of the Year. The entire ballroom erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. Billionaires and industry titans rose to their feet as I stood up from my table. I smoothed the fabric of my gown and walked down the long center aisle toward the brightly illuminated stage. I climbed the short flight of velvet-covered stairs, shook the presenter's hand with a firm grip, and accepted the heavy laser-etched glass trophy. I stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the sea of faces, the blinding spotlights reflecting off the brilliant diamond earrings I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money. I gripped the edges of the podium and let the applause naturally die down. When the room was completely silent, vibrating with anticipation, I leaned forward and began my acceptance speech. I did not start by thanking a supportive family. I did not dedicate the prestigious award to the loving parents who had supposedly shaped my success. David and Susan did not exist in this room. They did not earn a single syllable of my gratitude, and I refused to give them even a fraction of the credit for an empire they had actively tried to destroy. Instead, I spoke directly to the harsh, unforgiving reality of building a legacy entirely from the ground up. I talked about the brutal late nights, the paralyzing financial risks, and the sheer, unadulterated grit required to survive in an industry designed to break you. I looked out at the wealthiest people in the country and told them that true success is never just about acquiring capital or securing investments. It is about understanding the fundamental, undeniable value of absolute self-reliance. My voice echoed clearly through the massive ballroom as I addressed the complicated concept of loyalty. I stated that society often pressures us to carry the heavy, suffocating burden of toxic relationships simply because we happen to share a bloodline. I told the silent, captivated audience that sometimes the most crucial business decision you will ever make is not a corporate merger or a hostile acquisition. Sometimes the greatest strategic move is knowing exactly when to cut toxic dead weight. I spoke passionately about the immense, terrifying power of walking away from the people who actively try to drag you down. I declared that true greatness can only be achieved when you find the courage to violently sever the anchors holding you back. The room was utterly spellbound. I could see prominent investors nodding in profound agreement, captivated by the raw, unfiltered truth of my words. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to deliver the final irrevocable blow to the ghosts of my past. I held the heavy glass trophy up to the blinding stage lights. I announced to the room and to the millions of people who would eventually read the financial press reports the following morning that building a self-made empire requires a foundation of absolute authenticity. I stated clearly that I refused to carry the legacy of a family that had offered me nothing but betrayal, financial exploitation, and deep emotional abuse. I leaned close to the microphone and formally announced that as of that very morning, I had officially and legally changed my last name. I told the world that the surname printed on my birth certificate had been permanently erased from all federal documents, bank accounts, and corporate registries. I had completely severed my bloodline, officially adopting a brand new name that reflected my own fierce independence and the untouchable corporate dynasty I had built entirely alone. I thanked the Academy for the incredible honor, turned away from the podium, and walked off the stage to a roaring wave of applause, leaving the shattered, forgotten legacy of my abusers permanently dead and buried in my wake. The morning after the National Young Innovators Gala, the relentless Miami sun crept through the cracked, grime-covered blinds of a dilapidated apartment building on the industrial outskirts of the city. David and Susan sat in suffocating silence at their sticky, peeling laminate kitchen table, wrapped in cheap, frayed bathrobes. Resting on a plastic milk crate in the corner of their cramped, humid living space was a small, outdated television they had salvaged from a local thrift store. The screen was fuzzy, the colors distorted by a cheap antenna, but the image broadcasting across the morning financial news networks was unmistakably clear. They sat clutching their chipped ceramic coffee mugs, staring at the television as the news anchors enthusiastically replayed the highlight reel of the previous night. The high-definition footage showed their daughter glowing, untouchable, and radiating absolute power, stepping up to the podium in a midnight blue silk gown. They listened to the thunderous, roaring applause of billionaires and industry titans, honoring the very same woman they had so proudly thrown out onto the sidewalk just months prior. The television volume was turned up just loud enough for David and Susan to hear snippets of my acceptance speech. They heard me speak passionately to the crowd about the brutal reality of building an empire and the critical importance of severing toxic dead weight. They watched as the scrolling news ticker at the bottom of the screen officially displayed my brand new legally changed surname. The family name David and Susan had tried to use as a weapon of control and manipulation had been completely erased from my corporate empire. They were forced to watch the ultimate culmination of my success through a distorted, static-filled screen, painfully aware that they would never, ever be permitted to share in a single fraction of that glory. The camera panned over the audience of cheering venture capitalists, highlighting a world of elite wealth that David and Susan were now permanently banished from. The crushing reality of their absolute karma settled over the tiny roach-infested apartment like a suffocating lead blanket. There were no more elaborate lies to spin to their country club friends, and no more delusions of grandeur to cling to. Their current miserable existence was the direct, undeniable consequence of their own toxic greed. Brandon, the golden child they had sacrificed everything to protect, was currently waking up on a thin mattress in a federal penitentiary, facing 15 years of staring at concrete walls and steel bars. Keisha had completely vanished, fleeing the state the moment her federal plea deal was finalized, leaving a mountain of debt and a burned trail of destruction in her wake, without looking back once. The elite country club memberships, the sprawling mansion, the imported sports cars, and the high society status were all nothing but a humiliating, distant memory. As David prepared to put on his stiff polyester hardware store vest for his minimum wage shift, and Susan rubbed her bleach-burned hands before heading to the commercial laundry warehouse, the true devastating cost of their choices finally broke them. They had willingly traded a brilliant, fiercely loyal daughter for a sociopathic fraud, and in the end, they had lost absolutely everything. They were permanently condemned to live out their remaining years in grinding poverty and complete isolation, haunted every single day by the spectacular, highly publicized success of the child they had so callously discarded. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and now they had nothing left but the terrifying silence of an empty apartment and the bitter taste of their own catastrophic failure. Miles away from their miserable reality, I stepped out onto the expansive wraparound balcony of my newly purchased private estate. The cool morning ocean breeze swept past me gently, catching the edges of my silk robe as I leaned against the sleek glass railing. I held a warm cup of coffee in my hands, feeling the comforting heat seep into my palms while watching the brilliant golden sun slowly rise over the sparkling Miami horizon. The air felt incredibly light, completely devoid of the suffocating pressure and toxic expectations that had choked me for the first 29 years of my life. I took a deep, steadying breath, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the private shoreline below. A profound, unshakable sense of peace settled deep into my bones. I had not just survived the vicious betrayal of the people who were supposed to love me, I had actively weaponized that betrayal to build an untouchable fortress of success. I looked out over the endless expanse of the ocean, knowing with absolute certainty that my corporate empire was secure, my financial future was limitless, and my soul was finally my own. I did not carry a single ounce of anger or resentment anymore. The emotional tether to my abusers had been completely severed, leaving behind a woman forged in fire and polished to a razor-sharp edge. Your value is never determined by how the people using you rate your worth. True power comes from recognizing your own brilliance when those closest to you try to keep you in the dark. Society often tries to convince us that blood binds us to loyalty, even when that blood is actively poisoning our peace. But sometimes family turning their back on you and throwing you out into the cold is not a tragedy. It is the greatest, most liberating gift of freedom you could ever possibly receive. You owe nothing to the people who only value you for what they can extract from you. Have you ever had to permanently cut off your own toxic family members to finally live the life you truly deserve? Share your story of survival and independence in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal, setting unbreakable boundaries, and claiming your ultimate success. Looking back on the incredible journey of building Vanguard Elite and severing ties with the people who were supposed to protect me, the most profound lesson I have learned is that true loyalty is never guaranteed by blood. For years, society conditioned me to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred institution demanding endless forgiveness and perpetual sacrifice. However, my experience taught me a much harsher yet ultimately liberating truth. Toxic behavior does not magically become acceptable simply because it is inflicted by your own parents or siblings. When my parents and brother attempted to steal my intellectual property, extort my wealth, and gleefully throw me out onto the street, they shattered the illusion of unconditional familial love. In that devastating moment, I realized that allowing myself to be repeatedly exploited was not a sign of virtue or duty. It was a form of self-destruction. The greatest gift I ever received was the audacity they had to show their true colors, forcing me to recognize my own intrinsic value. I learned that cutting off toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of radical self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you certainly cannot build a towering empire while carrying the dead weight of people who want to see you fail. If you are ready to reclaim your independence and cut out the toxicity holding you back, share your own story and comment below.